a temple bell. She walked to the window. The palace gardens were measured in the same scale of absence. A ginkgo whose leaves should have been gold held the color of ash. A bronze lion, once bright with lacquer, was now the same dull gray as the war banners hanging limp from the colonnades. For a heartbeat she imagined the world without the friction of pigments, the kind of rule Grand Secretary Shen favored. Order, he said, was the only sure refuge. Without color, there could be fewer arguments about taste, fewer quarrels about ceremony. The thought sat on her tongue black as iron. By mid-morning the court had gathered a small panel in the Hall of Records. It was not yet a public trial, but it was meant to be a demonstration, an inquiry. Grand Secretary Shen presided in a chair that made the shoulders of those around him feel bowed merely by proximity. His robes were so dark they seemed to drink the light. Shen had a way of speaking that removed warmth from words. He addressed the assembly with the economy of a man who had practiced each syllable against a stone. The scaffolding of the state is not built of colors, he said. It is built of law and order. Heterodox practices, if not stilled, will ferment into sedition. A murmur passed through the scholars. Some nodded. Others looked at the paper in their hands, the thin pages containing inventories, tax registers, a kind of arithmetic for administration. Scholar Lewis, who had worn the same robes that morning, sat with his palms folded, ink dust at his cuffs, spectacles perched low. He had come because he could not turn his back on what he saw as a greater theft, the erasure of cultural memory. When Shen called for testimony, it was Li Wei who rose. He stood with the minimal flourish of a man who had grown used to speaking without theatrics, a single bow, the gentle placement of both hands upon the table. His voice, when it came, had the slow cadence of a careful brush stroke. He did not take the bait of rhetoric. He spoke instead in the language of ritual, of precedent, of the archive. The rights that bind this house are recorded not merely in law but in action, Li Wei said. A banner's vermilion, a lacquered bowl's sheen, these are not frivolities. They are mnemonic devices, tools by which the court remembers itself. To remove them is to starve the rituals their breath. Shen's mouth tightened. This is poetic defense, he said. But poetry does not refill coffers nor feed the hungry. It endangers order. A pigment cannot be allowed to dictate policy. Li Wei inclined his head as if accepting criticism. No one among us says pigment dictates law. But consider the precedents of court ritual. The archives show that the emperor's scales of ceremony have always included certain hues. When those hues were used properly, the people recognized the rights. When they were not, disorder followed. I ask only that we consider continuity preservation rather than summarily criminalizing long-standing practice. It was a careful defense, an argument built from the joints of custom rather than from the flaming rhetoric of freedom. It bought time. It bought argument that could be hurried through the folds of policy and turned into a motion for discretion rather than immediate execution. For those who had learned to read law as a weapon, Louis' words were a small, sharp restraint. But Shen was not alone in his fear. Whispers in the hallway had begun to collect like soot. Merchants who profited from austerity saw the soft trade of pigments as a threat to their new contracts. Provincial governors feared the stirring of memory leading to demands. Artisans trembled at the thought of sudden raids. Mei Lin watched and measured the distance between the rhetorical heart of Li Wei's defense and the practical instruments of Shen's power, the guards, the registries, the public spectacles of interrogation that eroded human dignity in the name of safety. After the meeting, Li Wei sought Mei Lin in her workshop. He moved with the careful urgency of a messenger who must not be seen speaking plainly. They will press, he said. Expect a tightening. There will be raids on suppliers, inventories will be checked, and anyone with a history in the southern workshops will be suspected. Mei Lin was grinding, as if she had been grinding since the world first paled. The stone was cold under her palm. Mineral dust came away like old bone. She looked up at him with the steadiness of someone who had already judged her own choices and accepted what might follow. "What do you advise?" she asked. "Proceed as if each stroke must be accounted for in law," Li Wei replied. "Hide what must be hidden. Publish what you can as ritual restoration. But be prepared to defend in public what our history has taught us, that color carries memory, and that memory is not a crime." They spoke with a wisdom that recognized equal parts peril and possibility. Mei Lin thought of the folded scrap of southern silk she had found, the sample of forbidden blue that had bloomed once in her teacup and become a kind of proof. She thought of Zhao's parable's colors like weathered people, colors that remembered insults and joys, and of how far that memory traveled into the channels of the heart. If the court had ears for such things, they had pressed their palms over their ears in preference for headlines and ledgers. In the days that followed, public interrogations began to shape themselves like a ritual of humiliation. Artisans were brought from the margins and led through corridors where senators watched and took notes. One man, a dyer who had once supplied banners for the mid-courtyards, was forced to kneel in the morning light and be questioned before the assembly. His hands trembled as if the bones within had been hollowed. Names were demanded, places, methods. When he could not provide them, when his memory failed, or when he chose silence, he was struck until his answers were broken into the shape the interrogators wanted. The spectacle allowed those who thirsted for order to claim a public victory while breeding a private terror. Mei Lin painted in corners. She did not stop. She became the quiet engine of a small, clandestine ministry. Nights were reserved for study pieces, small works that her hand could finish in a single sitting and hide inside the folds of the returned cloth. She painted a child's hand clutching a toy. She painted a sleeve where a single thread glowed with recovered crimson. She painted the emperor's face as a study of light on bone and skin. Each piece was precise as a prayer. Each piece was dangerous. At times she would take the finished work to the narrow stairwell that sank toward the kitchens and hide it beneath sacks of rice. Once, under the watch of an old cook who owed Mei Lin a favor for a repaired porcelain lid, she slid a small study into the seam of a tattered blanket and left with the calm of a woman who had closed a door on her own heart. She learned to make the act of hiding into a liturgy. The world had become one of quick breaths and withheld blinks. The emperor's recoveries, when they came, were small and secretive. A moment of recognition like a thin coin brought to light in a drawer. A hum remembered that belonged to no one else. The name of a childhood friend spoken as if from a dream. Consort Lion was a keeper of these moments. She would stand near the imperial couch and smooth the fold of a robe as if arranging a map. "Today he called me Mei," she told Mei Lin quietly once, in a corridor warmed by weak sunlight. "He said my name the way men say an oath." That tiny miracle Mei pulled at Mei Lin as a tide pulls at a shoreline. She was an artisan. She had learned to regard work as a means of ordering memory. But the emperor's brief lucidity transformed her labor from technical excellence to moral duty. If a pigment could return a name, then it was not merely color. It was a bridge across forgetting. To abandon it now would be like closing a bridge while people still clambered across, hands wide and urgent. Yet the risks multiplied. An artisan arrested on the Eastern Road had been a spark. A detained courier had been another. The networks that had once run like quiet rivers now bore the scrutiny of hydrological engineers, charts, ledgers, interrogatories. The attic of the world seemed full of listening devices that were merely hungry ears. Supply routes were watched, docks surveyed. Jars inspected with the ruthless patience of men who believed in the jurisdiction of their power. Mei Lin received word that Elder Zhao would be paraded in the afternoon as a witness to the extent of the network. The palace prepared quickly, as if a stage manager could make tragedy more presentable. The hall of records was swept, the benches arranged. Shen's supporters came in robes that matched the dark of his conviction, their faces carefully neutral as they took their seats. Outside, the air smelled like boiled tea and dust. Insects clung to the sunbeams that pierced lattices. Mei Lin stood at a distance. She had no title to present at that assembly. She had no voice in the official proceedings. But she could not bear being entirely absent. Consort Lion sat near her with a small scrap of crimson in her hands, which she smoothed as if soothing a newborn. "He will be called as evidence," Lion said, "not as consolation but as fact. They will want names." When Elder Zhao walked in, he moved like a man who had been beaten into the softness of a reed. His hands were ink-stained and cracked. He had been a keeper of jars all his life. The jars were his confession. The officials spoke to him sharply, prodding for the names Mei Lin and others had worked to protect. Xiao's eyes flickered to something in the audience. A face he could not name, and then away. "Did you supply the capital with pigments in the spring shipments?" an investigator asked. "I supplied what I had," Zhao answered, the word supply half gone from his mouth, heavy as winter wheat. "I did not know the law would change." The question was cruelty veiled as policy. Shen's men wanted to make the rule visible, that once something was labeled heterodox, every hand that had touched it could be punished. Lai Wei rose to speak again. He did not attempt to derail the process. Instead, as he had before, he shaped the argument into a ritual plea. "We must remember the function of materials in the rights of state. There is a difference between smuggling for profit and the transmission of ritual knowledge. We who argue for preservation ask the court to examine intent as well as action." He spoke so calmly that the words seemed to press down the restlessness in the hall like a palm upon steam. Some ministers softened. Others, who had lost family in the raids and famines that had carved Shen's convictions, hardened. It was enough, perhaps, to prevent immediate bloodshed. It was not enough to stop the machine of accusation. That night Mei Lin painted by the thin light of a lamp that smelled faintly of sesame. The pigment she mixed was modest and iron-rich wash for bones, a hint of indigo for shadow, but she painted as if each lifetime could be contained inside a brush sweep. Her hand remembered the rhythm of grinding stone and rice husk. She hummed the tune her grandmother taught her, the one that had been used to measure the passing of color. Under the music of her small songs, she folded each painted study into the dark of her drawer. If she had to flee, she would take the smallest things that proved a world had existed. And yet, even in the secret of her few preserved strokes, she felt the tug of the court. The emperor's name hovered in the air like incense. There was an image she kept returning to, a small garden where a boy had once chased a dragonfly. The memory had a navy blue smear at its center, the blue she had tasted once in a teacup and sworn to guard. If color could call a man back to a single line of a poem, then the work was worth the sacrifice. If color could not, then she would have offered the artist's labor and found her hands empty. Her contemplation of flight remained theoretic until Jiao's name appeared in a rumor. He had been seen near the salt roads, buying up small sacks of charcoal. The rumor might have been nothing, a man traveling for trade, but in the climate of suspicion, even rumor was a weapon. For the first time since she had come to the capital, Mei Lin considered leaving on the swallow of a whispered plan. She imagined trains of carts bearing her and son, and a few hidden girls, down the coast toward the towns that still remembered southern blue. She imagined workshops in exile, small and alive. Then, in the hush between one day and the next, she received a visit that braided duty back into her bones. Eunuch Rong, with his cautious gait, brought a small message from the inner chamber. The emperor had asked for a small painted panel. Nothing official. A private request, a scrap of personal longing that meant more than any decree. Rong's eyes were wet at their edges, the kind of moisture that comes from long-suppressed compassion. "He speaks of small things now," Rong said quietly. He asked, 2 days ago, about a child who used to carry a red kite. He asked what the color had been. Mei Lin smelled the sweetness of fear and hope mixed like a glaze. She had no right to be summoned, and yet the emperor's private need was precisely the ground on which she had built her art. To refuse now would be to deny the man a remembrance he could reach for with his failing hands. To accept would narrow the noose. "I will go," she said. She painted a small panel not for show but for touch. She mixed a thin, careful line of red she had preserved in a seam of cloth and set it along the rim of a painted bowl. She thought of the way Consort Lion smoothed a cuff and how names became domestic liturgies. She wrapped the panel in oiled paper and gave it to Rong, who cradled it as if it were a small, fragile child. When the eunuch left, Mai Lin felt the full weight of what she had chosen. There was a kind of logic that ran through her skin now. The world was dimming, the emperor slipping toward a winter of forgetfulness. And somewhere between those two states the possibility of a small, stubborn return remained. She had under her hand the ability to coax a name back into a face. How could she walk away from that? The very thing that made her dangerous to the state, the capacity to call memory, made her indispensable to the human beings in the palace. As midnight sank and the palace settled into the low breaths of lamps and distant lanterns, Mei Lin sat at her table and wrote in the thin journal she kept for color. She recorded the hue of the painted panel, the recipe she had used, the salt measure, and the length of mortar turns. She wrote it as if burying itself in a seed, something that might sprout again, even if the soil were scorched. Her hands moved with the slow certainty of ritual. And then, as if the palace walls themselves conspired to remind her of immediate peril, a bell tolled from the outer gates, a single, clear note. In the hall beneath her window, shouts began to rise. The sound of heavy boots on flagged stones moved like a distant summer storm. Guards were being summoned. Protocols were in motion. Shen's machinery was turning. She closed the journal, the ink still wet, and felt the future tighten like a ribbon around the throat. She could still leave. She could slip into the streets and follow the salt traders down toward the southern coves, toward workshops that might receive her and teach a new generation. There would be exile, there would be small victories. But she also knew, with the same stubborn clarity that had once guided her grandmother's hand at the grindstone, that some work was not meant to be carried alone across the sea. Some works required witnesses in the place where they had been taken from. Mei Lin moved to the window and watched the pale sky. In the distance the palace bell tolled again, lower and longer. The sound felt like a summons to stand and resist, or to flee and preserve. She thought of the emperor's voice as he had spoken a child's name. She thought of Li Wei's quiet advocacy and of Consort Lion's steadying presence. She thought of the artists parodied and the jars that had changed a man's fate. Her hand went to the drawer, where she had hidden the smallest of studies, the single painted bowl rim with the faint red smear, and she touched the corner of the oiled paper through which the pigment's memory might be felt. It was a small mercy, a provocation, an accusation. It was also perhaps a bridge. She closed the window on the chill and lit a lamp. Her decision did not feel like a triumph. It felt like the necessary, inevitable bending of a reed against wind. She would not flee tonight. She would prepare. She would set her brushes as if to a final, necessary work. Not because she imagined rescuing the empire from decline, she knew better than that, but because there remained an emperor who could, for a moment, remember how to name someone he loved. That small human recovery held more weight in the hollow of her palm than any policy argument. It would be enough to bind her to danger. Outside, down in the hall of records, men were arranging benches and papers. Servants lit more lamps. In the sleeping quarters, a single stir of activity moved through the palace like a second anxious heartbeat. Mei Lin took up a clean brush. She opened her journal to the page where she had drawn the small garden with the navy blue smear at its center. She set the brush to paper and, with the surety of someone who had learned to measure time by the way a pigment set, she began to lay down color. Her stroke was small at first, a practice motion. Then, with a breath that tasted of salt and old rice, she increased the pressure. The pigment spread like memory reawakening. Beyond the lattice the bell tolled once more, a sound that might have been warning or invitation. Her brush found the curve of a child's shoulder, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself the thought that what she did might matter beyond control and punishment. She kept painting. The knock came at the outer door before the first light of a new day. It was a sound she already knew, formal, inevitable, the small culmination of all the threads that had been pulled these last weeks. Somewhere in the palace the gears of the state had turned and now sought answer. Mei Lin set her brush down with fingers that smelled of mineral and resolve. The moment had arrived for which arguments and prayers had been prepared. She rose and wrapped the journal in cloth, then set a single small study at the center of the table, an offering, a proof, a confession if it had to be. Her heart beat not like panic but like a telltale drum measuring the time until choice. Outside the shuttered window the palace breath held. The bell sound faded into silence, and in that hush Mei Lin listened for the footsteps coming up the stair. When the guards came, they came with the slow, efficient inevitability of harvesters. The palace woke into a new kind of morning, one sharpened not by light but by the sound of booted feet moving in disciplined lines and the dull clack of leather on wood. Eunuch Rong, who had spent his life learning the palace's secret rhythms, felt the change before any of the painters in the inner halls. He had seen the petitions lined up like muted offerings on the Grand Secretary's table, had seen the way Shen's black sleeves fell over them like a judge's shadow. Now the shadow moved into action. At the docks the dawn was a low-slung confusion of smoke and gulls. Lanterns swung from hooks, ropes lay coiled like waiting serpents. Lying was found where men who work with ore tend to sleep, on a pallet of old sacks and broken crates. A blanket drawn over knees that smelled of salt and pigment. He had the kind of hands that tell a life story, the creased palms of a man who had wrestled cargo into place and scraped his knuckles raw against sun-cracked wood. A blue smear marked the heel of one thumb. Iron blue, the kind that ground into skin and did not wash away with water alone. They yanked him awake with a shout. Liang's eyes blinked into the harshness of lamplight. His first coherent thought was that someone had spilled ink. The guards bound him with rough cord, knotting his wrists until his forearms bled a little, the kind of wound that would only leave a memory. He tried to explain the boxes were for rope and rope alone, that the sacks were filled with coarse salt. The guards, cold-eyed, turned up the pressure, drew out a list of charges like a litany. Someone had been watching the docks for weeks. Someone had the patience of a spider. Farther inland, the search was quieter but no less merciless. Madame kept her little shop with the thrift of those who had learned to make every coin pay for more than bread. She sold cloth and string, and sometimes commodities that traveled from coastal caves to inland markets by way of back roads and bowed heads. The guards had lists of names. They pulled her from the wooden stool and marched her through alleys that smelled of tea and steaming dumplings, ordinary scents made obscene by the presence of men in armor. She clutched a small ledger to her chest as if it were a talisman. When they forced open the shutter of her back room, the guards found jars hidden beneath straw, crushed ore, smuggled powder, the faint tang of sea and iron. Aunt Mai's arrest was the one that made people in the lanes press their hands to their mouths. The midwife had been the kind of woman who wore other people's histories like shawls, soft, inconspicuous. Heavy with the weight of births she had attended and lullabies she had hummed. She had known Jiao's wife when Jiao still had a full household before the purge. Her memory was a map of names and faces wound around a small village by the river. The guards dragged her from her small house, where her spool of thread and the scent of boiled roots should have protected her from attention. They found the herbal tin tucked beneath a sewing basket, and in it, a folded scrap of paper with a single name and a place scrawled in cramped ink. For Aunt May, it was what she had written to herself to remember an old friend. For the Grand Secretary's investigators, it was a line on the web of sedition. Names began to fall like bees from a broken hive. Under questioning, under the sting of wet leather, and the cold negotiation of hunger denied, small people bartered the names that had circled their lives. They did not speak in conspiratorial phrases. They spoke in the practical terms of barter who had taken what, where sacks had been loaded, the color of a boat's sail. A dock loader's 8 coins owed to a dealer, a provincial agent's promise of 2 jars. These were the atoms that made the state's accusatory molecule. The Grand Secretary collected these atoms and built his case. Shen had the sort of mind that could take the scatter of testimony and make of it a single geometrical figure. He did not need proof of a deliberate, coordinated conspiracy if he could show a chain of dependencies, the docks, the supplier, the midwife's recollection of a village where recipes were taught as lullabies. It was the narrative that mattered as much as the facts. He would hold the narrative up to the court and say, "Look, here are the links. See how art becomes instrument, how memory becomes provocation." In the inner court, the effect of the arrests showed at once as ripples, and then as a slow, deep current. Servants exchanged glances they tried to make casual. Apprentices stopped humming the songs their grandmothers had taught them. Jiao heard the news of the raid as if it were a crack in an old earthen jar. He stood with his hands on the ledge of his small workshop and felt the world tilt. He had expected a raid one day. He had lived the exile of banned names and recipes long enough that the shock was a formal thing now, almost ceremonial. But that did not make the sight of lying his shoulders hunched, his shirt torn at the collar being led past the kiln any easier. Word arrived in the palace like smoke through a lattice, thin, urgent, impossible to snuff. Consort Lion was already awake when Eunuch Rong slipped into her quarters with the news, his face careful. Her first motion was not to the Emperor's bed, but to her chest of scraps. Comfort came to her these days not from ceremony but from stitched threads. She wrapped a small piece of embroidered silk about her hand as if it could take the sting of the world and turned her face toward the private door, where Mei Lin sometimes hurried through in the mornings, sleeves dusted in pigment. Mei Lin was in her studio when the eunuch found her. She had been painting a small panel 2 swallows mid-flight, their wings parts of a wash of cloud blue when a knock came that felt like the wrong season of things. She saw Rong's look and felt a coldness rise from her soles. He did not speak at once. He merely glanced toward the hallway as if he could see the noises that would soon arrive in the open. He said, "The guards took several men and women linked to the docks and to supplies." He said it in the flat ways of people who measure danger daily. Mei Lin's chest tightened as if some unseen hand had closed over it. She thought of Sun Eager, clumsy and too loud in his triumphs. The apprentice had already been questioned once. She had seen the panic in his face when a man in plain clothes had asked about routes and names. Rong's eyes flickered to the small wooden chest beneath Mei Lin's table. He did not ask, but his glance had already spoken the thing neither of them wanted to name. With each seized courier, the palace drew closer to the wellspring of paint. Consort Lion moved in the small ways of someone who had spent decades learning how to turn the tide by just a degree. She sought out officials she knew, women who kept the lists of the emperor's small pleasures, and men who remembered the old days when color was allowed in liturgy. She pressed fingers to forearms and whispered recollections of a robe's exact embroidery, cited an old ritual where a blue thread had called down a blessing. It was not merely sentiment, it was tactical. For a few hours, her quiet campaign, not an uproar but a constant. Needle-like persuasion kept the focus away from the painters and on the more public faces of the operation, the sailors, the loaders, the merchants. It was a reprieve of a kind, but even Lion's soft power had limits. The Grand Secretary, whose office smelled of ink and discipline, had already decided that a demonstration was necessary. Not content with private arrests, he wanted the court to see the web and to see fear. He convened meetings where the testimonies were read aloud,